Hello, beautiful people, and welcome. Hi. To a video about the 4-star selector that's coming next patch. With Durin's release, we're getting buffs to 7 Hex and Circle related characters, 4 of which are 5 stars, and 3 of which are 4 stars. And to accompany these buffs, we are getting a selector of one of the 3 4-star characters between Fischl, Razor, and Sucrose. So let's just get right into it. First off, let's just talk about Sucrose. Sucrose is very good. Out of those 3 characters, I think it's very fair to say that Sucrose is clearly the best one of the 3. But honestly, I don't think many people should select her. The reason for that is because Sucrose's constellations don't really do anything. Sucrose's C1 giving her 1 more skill charge isn't completely useless, but in the teams where you play her nowadays, you generally don't do rotations that are shorter than 15 seconds. And so you'll generally be able to get a skill every rotation, even without the C1. But because the C1 doesn't change your skill cooldown, it probably won't be enough to get 2 skills every rotation. The main reason why you would want to get a second skill is for the extra energy it generates. But if you're building with the assumption that you don't get the energy from the C1, the extra energy won't help when it happens. And if you're building with the assumption that you do get the energy from the C1, in the rotations where you don't have the extra skill, you'll be a little bit short on energy, and it's gonna feel awful. Sucrose's C1 is the quality of life constellation that sometimes helps a little bit to front load energy generation for your first rotation in Sage and Onslaught and stuff like that. But honestly, it is really not that big of a deal. So her C2 is 1 more tick of her burst. The burst deals animal damage 3 times. The C2 increases duration, so it does it 4 times instead. It's not really that big of a deal. It's difficult to get the right elemental absorption on Sucrose's burst, so the increased duration doesn't generally help with application. The best thing this does generally is it gives you a little bit more uptime on your EM buff, because Sucrose's EM buff gets refreshed every time she triggers a swirl or has her skill or burst hit an opponent, right? Because she has 2 different EM buffs, 1 on swirls, 1 on hitting opponents. So if you use the burst, your EM buff, instead of lasting for 8 seconds, will last from the moment you use the skill to 8 seconds after the last tick of burst. If the last tick of burst happens 6 seconds after the burst is cast, then that's 14 seconds, and if it happens another 2 seconds later, that's 16 instead. But generally, that won't really be a big difference, because most characters that do care about the EM buff from Sucrose do all of their damage before 14 seconds have elapsed anyways, so the extra time from the burst won't really help. C3 and 5 are talent levels, and none of her value is really from the talents directly. It just increases the damage, but she's not even building for talent damage, so it's pretty bad. C4 gives her cooldown refund on her skill when she uses normal attacks. Every 7 normal attacks, her skill gets a random 1 to 7 cooldown refund. If you are currently at 0 stacks of your skill, but your cooldown is almost back for your second stack, right? So if her skill cooldown is 15 seconds, if you use 2 skills and then 14 seconds later you proc this, when there's 1 second of cooldown left to your stack, even if you roll a 7, it won't actually give you the skill, and then the leftover 6 would go to the next one. You just get your skill back, and the overflow cooldown refund just disappears. So in practice, it's often less than a 3.5 average refund, but it doesn't really matter that much because the teams where you on-field Sucrose aren't really that meta anymore, so this doesn't tend to see too much value. And then C6, when her burst triggers an absorption, you get a 20% damage bonus. With the witch buffs, that's increased by a little bit, but pretty much every calc I do on Fischl assumes you don't get this because the pickup range for this buff is kind of finicky. It's honestly just a pain in the ass to get. It tends to be very unreliable, so it's not that big of a deal. So pretty much all of Sucrose's constellations kind of suck. All of the value you get from Sucrose is coming from these 2 passives and the fact that she's an Animo Catalyst, and I guess a little bit from the damage percent you get from the witch buffs as well. But once you have her at C0, you basically have the full package, so you don't really need anything else. For old players, they're likely to already have her, but even for new players, if you don't have Sucrose yet, getting her is nice. The fact that you have a selector that allows you to reliably get her without needing to go out of your way to get her on a banner you don't like. But if you're a very patient person, you'll get a Sucrose eventually, and once you do, it'll turn this selector retroactively into getting a Sucrose constellation, which is really bad. So pretty much the only people who should select Sucrose are people who don't have her and want to make a strong team that uses Sucrose now. If you wouldn't be using Sucrose yet, honestly, it's very possible you'll end up getting a Sucrose eventually anyways. So there's no need to get her. But if you're a little worried, at the end of the day, right, getting 4 stars, especially off-banner 4 stars, is very RNG. And being able to remove that random element, being able to guarantee that you get her, can be nice. But as we're gonna see, there's other things that are pretty nice here. So let's talk about the other 2 characters, starting with Razor. Right now, Razor's complete dog shit, but Razor is receiving some pretty big buffs with the witches and is going to become a fairly decent carry. The biggest problem with Razor is going to be that a very large portion of the buffs Razor is getting are constellation buffs. Namely, Razor is going to get an additional 70% crit value on his C6. What that means is that Razor before C6 will honestly be not all that good. On top of that, his best teams, by a pretty noticeable margin, all use Bennett with C6 to get him to do pyro damage instead of physical damage, because there's a lot of buffs that affect both pyro and electro damage, and Razor's damage profile is very split between his electro damage and his normal attack damage, so transforming his physical damage into pyro allows him to capitalize on dual element buffs that buff pyro and electro, but that don't buff electro and physical, like Traverse. But yeah, it makes it so that Razor as a whole is a lot worse if 1, you don't have his C6, 2, you don't have Bennett's C6, 3, you don't have Traverse's C6. And because of that, as much as it's very funny that we have a 4-star 1.0 carry that is like actually going to be arguably meta with the witch buffs, he's also one of the least accessible to new players because it's reliant on having C6 on multiple 4-stars. And because of that, I think that selecting his constellation tends to be a bad idea. The sort of people who will be able to see good results on Razor are people who already have a lot of 4-star constellations, which is generally people who have been playing for a long time. And if you have been playing for a long time, it's very possible you already have a bunch of cons on Razor. If you are one of the few people that has C6 Bennett, has Traverse, likes Razor, and doesn't have C6 Razor, then yeah, obviously you can go for him. It's not bad to get, but I think it's going to be a very, very small subset of players. And most players are going to be better off going for Fischl. As a whole, I'd say that Fischl is a bit worse than Sucrose, but she gets a lot more value from her constellations. While Sucrose's constellations don't really do anything, multiple constellations on Fischl are actually relevant. Keep in mind, with the witch buffs, she's buffing attack and or EM, both to the active party member, but also to herself, which makes constellations that increase personal damage a bit more impactful as well. First of all, the C1 has actually been relevant in this Stygian Onslaught because the extra coordinated attack from Oz that does physical damage here is actually really helpful at filling up the Hera bar that counts the amount of times you hit it. If you want to have Hera register the highest source of damage as physical so that it doesn't get an absorption, you can actually use Fischl with her C1 and get through that fairly quickly. But in terms of like actual damage, this is completely useless because it only happens when Oz isn't on the field, and if you are ever playing on-field Fischl and doing attacks on her, Oz should be out, because Oz does a lot of damage. So this is pretty much only ever going to be useful for stuff like the current Hera stuff. C2 doesn't do a lot of damage, but the increase to the AoE of her skill can sometimes matter when hitting an enemy with your skill is necessary for you to get the right swirl setup, which was actually the case for a lot of Dendro teams with Fischl, especially with Nahida, who has very strong Dendro application. So getting all of your possible Electro hits and overtaking Nahida's Dendro with Electro so you could swirl that is actually very important. And so the C2 mattered for those teams. But now that Nahida's kind of fallen off, now that Aggravate teams are not that good, and the ones that like remain don't even necessarily use Nahida anymore, now that we also have more alternatives to VV Shredders in those Aggravate teams that don't necessarily need to have an Electro Aura, that aspect of the C2 doesn't really matter anymore, and just in terms of damage, it's not that good. And then you have the C3. Fischl is one of the few characters that does pretty much all of her damage from one ability. Technically, she does get additional damage instances that don't scale with skill talent level from her Ascension 4 passive, and if you get her C6, that as well. But the large majority of her damage is coming from just Oz's hits, and so skill talent levels are going to be pretty good. C4, Burst deals a bit more damage, and it heals Fischl when it ends. This is fine. I think it's mainly nice in teams that don't have a healer, but that do have a character that doesn't need healing. So especially Chlorine teams, where she can heal herself, so you don't need to bring a healer. But if you don't bring a healer, you don't have anyone restoring HP if you take damage on your supports. So if you end up taking damage on Fischl, the C4 can be nice there, but it doesn't really do too much, honestly. C5 is burst sound levels, which is really bad, because when you refresh Oz with your burst, it still looks at your skill damage outside of just the initial cast of transforming into Oz. And finally, C6, which is the big one. C6 is big for multiple reasons. It extends Oz uptime from 10 to 12 seconds. By default, if you use your skill and then refresh Oz when the uptime is over, at C0, that's 20 seconds of uptime with 25 seconds cooldown. At C6, that's 24 seconds of uptime, pretty much full uptime when you include animations. That extra 2 seconds is nice. It's 2 extra hits from Oz. It's also more uptime on your Ascension 4 passive that triggers the electro hits whenever you trigger electro reactions on your on-fielders. It also adds a coordinated hit of electro every time your active character does a normal attack. It works the same way as Yelan and Xingqiu, where you just need to be doing an animation that's considered normal attack, but it registers even earlier than them. So stuff like Mavika Charge Attack, for example, on the first hit will trigger this. Honestly, the damage from the C6 isn't generally that big of a deal, but the extra elemental application often does increase the amount of reactions you trigger on Fischl, which can be pretty nice. On top of that, the witch buffs, right, as a quick reminder, by default give 22.5% attack when you trigger Overload and 90 EM when you trigger Electro Charge or Lunar Charged, as long as Oz is on the field. At C6, that's doubled. So you get longer uptime on your damage and on your buff, and a bigger buff. Basically, official C6 is even more valuable than it was before. So out of those 3 characters, unless you already have Fischl at C6, I would almost always recommend going for Fischl Constellations. That being said, if you don't intend on playing Fischl, then getting cons on her won't do anything. If you don't have Sucrose yet, and you actually play a character that likes Sucrose, like Milani, like Flynn's, if you somehow manage to dodge Sucrose on the Flynn's banner, being able to get her there will be really nice. And yeah, that's pretty much it, honestly. Overall, this selector it's just a Fischl constellation. It's not a selector, it's just a Fischl constellation. Not that I'm unhappy about it. To be fair, it is also a way to get Sucrose for people that are very new, right? Unlike Fischl, Sucrose is not in the shop rotation, so you cannot guarantee a Sucrose just by buying her from the shop. So if you just get dog shit RNG on your pulls, you might just not have Sucrose, so being able to get her from that is really nice as well. And then Razor is just for, honestly, it's just for people who already have C6 of the other 2. If you have Sucrose and Razor both at C0 or both at like not C6, I could see a world where I'd pick Razor over Sucrose, because as much as Razor is not nearly as good, his constellations actually matter, whereas Sucrose's cons kind of don't. I'd probably still pick Sucrose's C1 over Razor cons, just because it's a nice con to have, I guess. But honestly, the cons past C1 are just straight up worthless. So if you have C1 Sucrose, I think pick Razor over her if you already have C6 Fischl. But yeah, as usual, I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a thing or two, and I will see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.